Before sunrise on August 7, 1944, German tanks were moving west through Normandy, not retreating, attacking. 4 armored divisions had been ordered toward one narrow point on the map, Avranches, the gateway through which Patton's Third Army was pouring into open country. For a few hours, fog covered the German columns. Then the sun came up, and the most important thing the P-47 Thunderbolt destroyed that day was not a tank. It was the German timetable. That distinction matters, because Mortain became one of the most repeated air power stories of the Second World War. Pilots returned claiming scores of armored vehicles destroyed. Later accounts turned the road into a graveyard made almost entirely from the sky. But when investigators examined the wrecks on the ground, the story became harder and more interesting. The fighter bombers had not killed every Panzer. They had done something operationally worse. They had made daylight movement almost impossible, and an armored counterattack that could not move in daylight was already dying. 2 weeks earlier, the German front in western Normandy had begun to come apart. For nearly 7 weeks after D-Day, the Americans had fought through the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of sunken roads, earthen banks, small fields, and hidden firing positions. It was terrain built for ambush. A tank could be only a few yards away and still be invisible. Then on July 25, the 1st United States Army opened Operation Cobra west of Saint-Lô. Heavy bombers struck a narrow section of the German front. Some bombs fell short and killed Americans waiting to advance, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. But the bombardment and the ground assault tore open a gap the exhausted German divisions could not seal. American armor broke through. Coutances fell. Avranches fell on July 30. And at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, the battlefield suddenly widened. George Patton's newly activated Third Army drove through the Avranches corridor, then fanned west into Brittany and east toward the Loire and Le Mans. The advance was fast, its supply line was not. Fuel, ammunition, food, replacement vehicles, nearly everything had to pass through the narrow Avranches bottleneck. On a map, the German answer looked obvious. Strike west through Mortain, reach Avranches, cut the corridor, separate Patton from his supplies, and trap the American spearheads beyond it. It was the kind of plan that became more attractive the farther it moved from the battlefield. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the west, understood the danger. His divisions had been fighting continuously since June. Their tank strengths were low. Their crews were exhausted. Fuel was scarce, and every formation pulled together for the attack would be taken from a front already close to collapse. Kluge wanted room to withdraw toward the Seine. Hitler ordered him to attack in the opposite direction. The operation was codenamed Lüttich. Its armored mass came from the 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Roughly 120 tanks and assault guns were available for the opening blow. Dangerous, but nowhere near the strength such an operation truly required. There was another weakness. The Allies knew an attack was coming. Ultra-decrypts had exposed the German intention before the offensive began. Senior American commanders had warning, but that warning did not reach every frontline unit in time. So Mortain produced a strange combination: strategic foreknowledge above, tactical surprise below. The German columns moved before dawn on the night of August 6 into August 7. They avoided a long artillery preparation. Darkness and fog concealed the roads. Allied aircraft stayed on the ground. At first the plan worked. Das Reich pushed into Mortain. German infantry and armor penetrated the American positions. The 30th Infantry Division had only recently taken over the sector, and several of its units were hit before they fully understood the scale of the attack. Above the town stood a bare height marked on American maps as Hill 314. From its summit, an observer could see the roads feeding Mortain and the approaches beyond it. That made the hill valuable. It also made the men on it a target. More than 700 Americans, most from the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, were cut off when German forces moved around them. They had limited ammunition, little food, almost no water, no secure road out. They would remain surrounded for 5 days. The hill was not merely a trapped infantry position. It was an observation platform over the entire German attack. 2 forward observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion could see the roads below. Using field radios, they directed American artillery onto junctions, assembly areas, and columns trying to move through the valley. The Panzers had entered a battlefield where the high ground was still reporting every movement. Again and again, shells landed on the roads. German vehicles halted. Following vehicles closed up behind them. Columns that needed speed began to compress. The men on Hill 314 paid heavily for that delay. German attacks climbed toward the summit. Ammunition ran down. Airdropped supplies often landed outside the perimeter or drifted into German hands. At one point, American artillerymen improvised a method that sounded impossible until it worked. They removed the contents from smoke shell carriers, packed medical supplies inside, and fired them onto the hill so the wounded could receive plasma and morphine. The same guns breaking the German attack were also feeding the men who could still see it. By late morning, the fog began to thin. That was the moment the entire German plan changed. The attack had been built around darkness, mist, and surprise. It had no safe answer for clear skies. As the ceiling lifted, roads appeared, fields appeared, and the German columns, stalled, compressed, and pointed west, appeared with them. The American 9th Air Force and the Royal Air Force's 2nd Tactical Air Force moved into the battle. P-47 Thunderbolts came in from the American side. Rocket-armed Hawker Typhoons came in from the British side. Flights attacked, withdrew to rearm and refuel, and were replaced by others. Across the day, fighter bombers returned again and again over the Mortain sector. German soldiers called them Jabos, short for Jagbomber, fighter bomber. The word carried more than fear of being destroyed. It meant movement had become visible. A tank under trees might survive. A tank waiting in a lane might survive, but an armored division had to do more than survive. It had to move fuel forward, pull damaged vehicles aside, bring ammunition up, pass orders down, evacuate wounded, and keep hundreds of soft-skinned vehicles connected to the fighting tanks. That entire system was vulnerable. The Thunderbolts' 8.50 caliber machine guns could rip through trucks, half-tracks, motorcycles, gun crews, and exposed personnel. Its bombs and rockets could crater roads, ignite fuel vehicles, damage tracks, and force crews out of their machines. Its heavy radial engine and rugged airframe gave pilots a better chance of surviving the low-level anti-aircraft fire that came up from the columns. But the P-47 was not a magic tank opener. A German tank presented a small, armored target. Rockets were difficult to aim precisely. Bombs had to land close. Machine gun fire could damage exposed equipment and thin surfaces, but it could not reliably punch through the main armor of a Panther or Panzer IV. That is why the numbers claimed in the air grew so much larger than the numbers later confirmed on the ground. In the confusion of a low-level attack, smoke could mean a burning tank, or a burning truck behind it. A crew abandoning a vehicle could look like a kill. A tank disabled by artillery, then attacked from the air, could be claimed by both. Several pilots might strike the same target. From a cockpit moving at hundreds of miles per hour, there was no clean way to conduct a forensic investigation. There was only a target, a burst of fire, smoke, and the next pass. The claims were enormous. RF formations reported dozens of tanks destroyed and many more damaged around Mortain. American airmen added their own claims. Together, the totals rose far beyond the number of armored vehicles investigators could later confirm. Post-battle operational research teams examined 78 German armored vehicles in the area. They attributed 21 to air attack. Others had been destroyed by American ground forces, abandoned intact, blown up by their own crews, or left with causes that could not be established. 21 was far below the wartime claims. It was also not nothing. But the more important evidence came from the German command itself. By noon on August 7, the headquarters of the German 7th Army reported that the offensive had been brought to a complete standstill by unusually strong fighter-bomber activity. Not annihilated, stopped. That was the difference between counting wrecks and measuring effect. Air power did not have to destroy every tank. It had to destroy the attack's ability to behave like an attack. The Germans needed speed before the Americans could reinforce Mortain. They needed fuel trucks to reach the Panzers. They needed engineers to clear blocked lanes. They needed commanders to move between units. They needed daylight hours to recover the ground lost after Cobra. The fighter bombers attacked all of those needs at once. A lead vehicle halted on a narrow bocage road could trap everything behind it. A burning fuel truck could stop an entire column. Crews who left their vehicles for cover might return after dark, but the timetable would not return with them. And every hour lost at Mortain gave the Americans another hour to strengthen the front and continue the encirclement forming farther east. That is why Hill 314 and the aircraft overhead cannot be separated. The artillery observers on the hills saw the roads. The guns hit the concentrations. The air attacks punished movement and resupply. American infantry held the ground that made the whole system possible. The German offensive was not defeated by a single weapon. It was trapped between weapons that covered one another's weaknesses. The Panzers could hide from aircraft under fog. They could not hide from observers above the valley. They could wait for darkness. They could not recover the daylight already lost. Hitler ordered the attack renewed. That decision no longer had a path to success. Klug could see the danger. The armored formations sent west toward Avranches were now facing away from the route they would soon need to escape. To the north, British and Canadian forces were pushing south toward Falaise. To the south, Patton's army had turned east, then north toward Argentan. The German counterattack had not cut the Americans in two. It had driven some of Germany's strongest remaining armored formations deeper into the mouth of a closing pocket. Operation Lüttich had been intended to save the German position in Normandy. Instead, it accelerated the conditions that destroyed it. Within roughly 48 hours, the offensive had lost any realistic chance of reaching Avranches. Fighting continued around Mortain, and the isolated Americans on Hill 314 held until relief reached them. But the operational moment had passed. The Germans had spent armor, fuel, and time. They had gained almost none of the ground that mattered. Then the larger trap began to close. The towns that defined it were Falaise, Argentan, Trun, and Chambois. Inside that shrinking area, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army tried to force men and vehicles east through a narrowing gap. The roads filled with transport, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, ambulances, fuel trucks, artillery tractors, half-tracks, tanks. Vehicles that could still move pressed around vehicles that could not. Allied artillery fired into the corridor. Aircraft attacked the roads. Units dissolved into mixed groups trying to escape before the opening disappeared. From August 19, the Polish 1st Armored Division held the high ground at Mont Ormel, Hill 262, overlooking one of the final escape routes near Chambois. The Poles called the position the Mace. For days, they fought German forces trying to break out from inside the pocket and SS units attacking from outside to hold the corridor open. They were nearly cut off themselves, but they held the height. American and Polish forces linked near Chambois, and by August 21 the gap was effectively closed. The German armies in Normandy did not vanish inside the pocket. Many men escaped, others were captured or killed. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed, abandoned, or blown up by their crews. And once again, aerial claims were more dramatic than the evidence later found among the wrecks. That did not make tactical air power irrelevant. It exposed the wrong measurement. A tank destroyed by a rocket was easy to photograph. A tank abandoned because its fuel truck burned 20 miles behind it was harder. A column that waited under trees until nightfall did not appear in a victory claim. A staff officer who could no longer move by day did not become a wreck. A division that arrived 12 hours late did not leave a crater. But war is governed by more than destruction. It is governed by time, movement, supply, coordination, and the ability to act before the enemy can answer. At Mortain, Allied tactical air attacked those invisible parts of the German army. The P-47 Thunderbolt was built for that kind of violence. It was large, powerful, and difficult to kill. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine produced roughly 2,000 horsepower. It carried 8 heavy machine guns and could lift bombs and rockets into the battlefield. Those specifications mattered, but they were not the real weapon. The real weapon was repeatability. A flight could appear over a road, attack, leave, and be replaced. A column that survived one pass still had to fear the next. The threat did not have to be present over every lane at every second. It only had to be frequent enough that German commanders could no longer trust daylight. That uncertainty spread through the whole movement system. Drivers waited, crews dispersed, convoys broke into smaller groups, repairs took longer, fuel arrived late or did not arrive at all. Orders were carried after dark. The fighter bomber became a tax on every German action, and during a counterattack built on speed, that tax was fatal. This is the honest measure of the Thunderbolt at Mortain. Not the largest claim painted beneath a cockpit, not the most spectacular photograph of a burning tank. The P-47 shared the sky with RAF Typhoons. It shared the battle with American artillery. It shared the victory with the infantry holding Hill 314. And its greatest effect was not the number of panzers it penetrated. It was the number it prevented from moving when movement still mattered. Operation Lüttich began under fog because the Germans understood the danger of the sky. It failed after the fog lifted because that danger reached beyond armor. It reached fuel, roads, radios, crews, schedules, the whole machinery that turned separate vehicles into an offensive. The Thunderbolt did not destroy every German tank at Mortain. It destroyed the day those tanks needed.